The stream appeared before the sound reached them. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto watched it emerge from the darkness of the cave mouth across the ravine, a ribbon of orange light that seemed to float through the air with impossible slowness, and in the half-second before his mind could process what he was seeing, he noticed how beautiful it was, how the droplets caught the morning sun filtering through the jungle canopy, how they sparkled like festival lanterns drifting on summer wind. Then the heat arrived. Not the wet, oppressive heat of Guadalcanal that had become their constant companion, but something else entirely, a wall of furnace air that slammed into his face from 60 meters away, and with it came the smell, gasoline and something sweet and chemical that burned his nostrils. And then the screaming began. Private Sato had been standing at the cave entrance when the flame touched him. Yamamoto had known Sato since training in Osaka, had shared rations with him, had listened to him talk about his younger sister who worked in a textile mill. Now Sato was burning, not like paper burns or wood burns, but burning the way oil burns on water, the flames spreading across his uniform in sheets that seemed to cling and flow at the same time, transforming him into a moving torch that stumbled out into the clearing. The screaming was high-pitched, inhuman, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond anything Yamamoto had heard in 8 months of combat. Sato's arms were raised above his head, as if surrendering to the sky itself, and he spun in a terrible dance, and the flames followed every movement, rippling across his back like a living thing. Yamamoto's rifle fell from his hands. He didn't decide to drop it. His fingers simply stopped working. Around him, the other members of their defensive position stood frozen, watching Sato burn, and Yamamoto realized that none of them were moving to help, that they were all locked in the same paralysis, transfixed by the impossibility of what they were seeing. The Americans had emerged from the jungle tree line like wraiths, and Yamamoto could see them now, shapes in their mottled uniforms, but his eyes kept returning to the one carrying the weapon. It looked wrong. The 2 tanks strapped to the man's back were too large, too bulky, and the nozzle he carried seemed absurdly long, like some industrial tool from a factory, not a battlefield weapon. But it had created Sato's fire, and now the American was turning, sweeping the nozzle across the cave mouth, and another stream of flame erupted into the darkness. The second burst illuminated the interior of the cave in flickering orange light, and Yamamoto saw silhouettes writhing inside, black shapes against the flame, and more screaming joined Sato's, though Sato had finally collapsed, still burning, his movements reduced to twitching spasms in the dirt. The smoke that rose from him was thick and black, and carried a smell that made Yamamoto's stomach convulse. He had smelled death before. The jungle was full of it. But this was different. This was meat cooking, grease burning, a barbecue smell that was obscenely familiar and utterly wrong, and his mind recoiled from the recognition even as his body gagged. Sergeant Nakamura started shouting orders, his voice cutting through the screaming and the roar of the flames, but Yamamoto couldn't process the words. He was watching the American with the flamethrower move toward their position, flanked by riflemen, and Yamamoto's training said he should shoot, should fight, should defend this small piece of jungle they had been ordered to hold until death, but his hands wouldn't reach for his rifle. The flame weapon spoke again, and this time Yamamoto saw the whole sequence, a small puff of smoke from the nozzle, then the pilot light catching, then the stream igniting and expanding as it travelled through the air, spreading as it flew, becoming wider and more diffuse, a cone of fire that seemed to seek targets the way water seeks low ground. The stream hit a machine gun position to Yamamoto's left. He had been talking to those men an hour ago, Suzuki and Honda, arguing about whether the war would last another year or two, whether Japan could win if China fell, whether their families would understand why they had died so far from home. Now they were screaming. Honda tried to run, but the liquid fire had splashed across his back and legs, and he made it 3 steps before falling. Suzuki stayed in the position, beating at flames that had engulfed his arms and chest, and Yamamoto could see that Suzuki's hands were on fire too, that he was burning himself as he tried to put out the flames on his uniform, and the futility of it was worse than the burning itself. Someone finally shot at the Americans. Yamamoto heard the crack of an Arisaka rifle, then another, but the American with the flamethrower kept walking forward, kept sweeping that terrible nozzle back and forth, and another burst of flame screamed toward a foxhole position. Yamamoto understood now why they had been losing ground so quickly over the past 2 days, why the American advance had seemed unstoppable despite the defensive positions they had prepared. The Americans weren't fighting the way they used to fight. They had brought this new thing, this weapon that transformed air and distance into killing space, that made trenches and bunkers and spider holes into traps for their defenders rather than strong points. The heat was everywhere now. Yamamoto's face felt sunburned, his eyes were watering from smoke, and the air tasted like petroleum and char. He finally made himself move, diving behind a fallen log as another stream of flame roared overhead. The sound was distinct from anything else in war. Artillery had its distant whistle and close crack. Machine guns had their hammering chatter. Rifles barked and snapped. But the flamethrower had a whooshing roar, like a gas heater igniting but sustained, deeper, angrier, and beneath it was a liquid hiss that reminded Yamamoto of rain on hot metal. The sound and smell and heat combined into a sensory experience that bypassed thought entirely, that spoke directly to something ancient in his brain that understood fire as the ultimate predator. Lieutenant Sakamoto emerged from a covered position and tried to organize a counterattack, gesturing toward the American position with his sword, shouting about honor and duty, but his words sounded thin and distant against the roar of the flames. 3 soldiers rose to follow him, and Yamamoto saw the American with the flamethrower turn almost casually, the nozzle tracking smoothly, and then there was more fire, and Sakamoto's white uniform tunic became a canvas for orange flames that spread and merged until he was entirely covered. His sword fell from his hand. He didn't scream like the others had. Instead, he made a low groaning sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest, and he walked forward 2 steps, then sideways, then backward, before sitting down carefully, as if he had simply decided to rest, and the flames continued to consume him. Yamamoto pressed himself against the jungle floor. The heat radiating from burning vegetation and burning men made the air shimmer, and through the distortion he could see the American flamethrower operator moving closer, methodically working his way along their defensive line, spraying fire into every concealed position, every dugout, every pile of brush that might hide a soldier. The man moved with practiced efficiency, like a farmer spreading fertilizer, like this was routine work, like turning human beings into torches was just another job that required technique and focus, but no particular emotion. The rationale part of Yamamoto's mind tried to understand. Fire was just combustion. The weapon was just a device that projected ignited fuel. Men died from fire the same as they died from bullets or shells or bayonets. But the rational part of his mind was losing its argument with the older part, the part that had learned around ancient campfires that flames were sacred and terrible, that burning was a death reserved for the worst criminals and enemies, that to be consumed by fire was to be unmade in the most fundamental way. He had seen men die from many causes in his months on Guadalcanal. He had seen them torn apart by machine gun fire, seen them eviscerated by artillery, seen them waste away from fever and starvation. But none of those deaths had carried this particular horror. None of them had transformed living men into thrashing human candles that cooked in their own fat. The Americans were shouting to each other in English, coordinating their advance. Yamamoto caught fragments of words he didn't understand, but the tone was businesslike, almost bored. They weren't treating this as a great battle or a crucial engagement. They were just clearing positions, checking off objectives, moving through their assigned sector. The flamethrower operator paused to check his tanks, and Yamamoto saw other soldiers covering him, rifles up, scanning for threats. The flamethrower man said something that made one of them laugh. They were laughing. While Sato and Honda and Suzuki and Sakamoto burned and died, the Americans were laughing. The fire had spread to the vegetation now. The jungle itself was starting to burn, and the green canopy that had provided concealment and comfort was becoming another source of danger. Yamamoto heard crashing sounds as burning branches fell, heard the snap and pop of bamboo exploding from internal pressure, felt the smoke thickening around him until breathing required conscious effort. The Americans had learned to use the jungle against them. They had learned that the thick vegetation that made excellent cover was also excellent fuel, that positions buried in foliage became death traps when that foliage burned. Another soldier broke and ran. Yamamoto recognized him as one of the replacements who had arrived last week, barely 18 years old, still soft from his civilian life in Tokyo. He made it 5 meters before a burst from an American rifle cut him down, and Yamamoto felt a perverse relief that the boy had died from bullets rather than fire, that his death had been quick and comprehensible. The flamethrower operator was reloading now, or rather, he was doing something with the tanks on his back, adjusting valves, and Yamamoto realized the weapon must have limited ammunition, that eventually the fuel would run out and the terrible flame would stop. But how much fuel did those tanks hold? How many more bursts of fire could they produce? How many more men would burn before the operator was empty? Sergeant Nakamura was crawling toward Yamamoto's position, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, his rifle dragging in the dirt behind him. When he reached the log, he pressed his face close to Yamamoto's and spoke in a harsh whisper. "We have to fall back. We can't fight this. We can't—" His voice trailed off. Orders were to hold this position. Standing orders for all defensive positions on Guadalcanal were to fight to the death, to die in place rather than retreat, to make the Americans pay for every meter of ground. But Nakamura was a veteran of China, had seen more combat than anyone in the unit, and Yamamoto could see in his eyes that something fundamental had broken, that the sergeant had reached some internal limit where survival became more important than orders. "The others," Yamamoto whispered back. Nakamura shook his head. "Dead or burning. Maybe 6 of us left. We go now, while the smoke is thick, or we burn too." They started crawling backward, using smoke for cover, moving low and slow through the underbrush. Behind them, the roar of the flamethrower continued, punctuated by rifle fire and the occasional crash of a mortar round. The Americans were thorough. They were eliminating every possible position, making sure no one was left behind to fire on their rear as they advanced. Yamamoto glanced back once and saw a stream of fire arc into the command dugout, where Lieutenant Sakamoto had briefed them that morning. The flames seemed to pour into the entrance like liquid, and Yamamoto imagined the interior filling with fire, imagined anyone trapped inside, and he turned away and crawled faster. They made it 50 meters before they heard someone behind them. Another survivor was following, and then another. 5 men total, all that remained of 32 soldiers who had held this position. They regrouped in a small depression behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath, checking wounds, avoiding each other's eyes. No one spoke about what they had seen. No one mentioned the burning men, or the American weapon, or the fact that they had abandoned their position. They simply crouched in the jungle, listening to the battle continue without them, feeling the heat of distant fires on their faces. Private Kimura, the youngest of the survivors, was shaking. Not the normal tremor of fear or exhaustion, but violent full-body shakes that made his teeth chatter. Nakamura put a hand on his shoulder but said nothing. What was there to say? They had all seen the same thing. They all carried the same images now, images that Yamamoto knew would never fade, that would follow them through whatever remained of their lives, however long or short those lives might be. "What was that weapon?" Kimura finally whispered. "What kind of men use such a thing?" No one answered. Yamamoto thought about the industrial factories back in Japan, about the petroleum refineries and chemical plants that had been repurposed for war production, about how modern warfare had become a contest of industrial capacity rather than martial courage. The Americans had better factories, more resources, more scientists and engineers who could dream up new ways to kill. The flamethrower was just another expression of that advantage. another way that American industrial might could be projected into the Pacific theatre. But knowing that didn't make it less terrible. Understanding the mechanics didn't diminish the horror. They moved deeper into the jungle, navigating by instinct and memory, heading vaguely northwest toward where they hoped to find other Japanese units. The sounds of combat faded behind them, replaced by the ordinary noises of the jungle, birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the humid air. But everything felt different now. The jungle that had been their refuge and stronghold now seemed fragile, combustible, a vast pile of kindling waiting for the spark. Every shadow might hide an American with a flamethrower. Every breath of wind might carry the smell of petroleum and burning flesh. They found a stream and stopped to drink and wash blood and soot from their faces. Kimura vomited into the water, and no one commented. They were all struggling to keep control, all fighting the urge to run blindly until exhaustion dropped them. Yamamoto knelt at the stream's edge and looked at his reflection in the slow-moving water. His face was blackened with smoke, his eyes red and swollen, his expression hollow. He looked like a ghost of himself, like something that had died but hadn't stopped moving yet. "They'll use it everywhere now," Nakamura said quietly. "Every position, every bunker, every cave. We designed our defenses to resist bullets and shells. But fire goes where bullets can't. Fire follows tunnels and fills spaces and finds every hiding place. Our defensive doctrine is obsolete." It was the most devastating strategic analysis Yamamoto had ever heard, delivered in the tone of a man reading from a field manual. Nakamura was right. The Japanese had spent months fortifying positions on Guadalcanal, building elaborate networks of bunkers and tunnels and spider holes, creating defensive complexes that could withstand artillery bombardment and frontal assault. But those same positions were perfect targets for flamethrowers. The connecting tunnels became distribution channels for fire. The reinforced walls that stopped bullets and shell fragments also trapped heat and smoke. The narrow entrances that made positions easy to defend with small forces also made it impossible to escape once fire came pouring in. "What do we tell the captain?" another soldier asked. "When we reach the company command post, what do we report?" "The truth," Nakamura said. "The Americans have a new weapon that makes fortified positions into death traps. We need new tactics. We need to fight in open ground where fire can't corner us. We need—" He stopped. They all knew what he was about to say. They needed to retreat. They needed to abandon the fixed defensive doctrine that had been drilled into them since basic training. They needed to admit that holding ground at any cost was suicide when the enemy could burn defenders out of their positions like insects from a nest. But such talk was dangerous. Defeatism could be punished by summary execution. Officers who suggested retreat were often shot by their own commanders. The Japanese military culture valued spirit over strategy, considered determination a valid counter to material superiority. Yamamoto had heard speeches about how Japanese soldiers, fighting with pure hearts and unbreakable will, could overcome American advantages in equipment and firepower. But will didn't stop fire. Spirit didn't extinguish flames. Courage meant nothing when your uniform was burning and your skin was cooking and you were screaming for death to come faster. They continued moving northwest. The jungle gradually changed around them, becoming less familiar. They were leaving their assigned sector, entering territory that belonged to other units, or perhaps to no one, empty ground between defensive positions where both sides patrolled but neither controlled. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in dusty shafts, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Yamamoto's legs moved automatically, one foot in front of the other, his body operating on instinct, while his mind replayed the morning's horror in endless loops. He couldn't stop thinking about Sato's dance, the way his burning friend had spun and stumbled, arms raised as if the fire had taken control of his body and was making him perform some grotesque ritual. He couldn't stop hearing the pitch of those screams, higher than natural, as if pain had transformed Sato's voice into something non-human. He couldn't stop smelling the sweet, wrong smell of cooking meat. These sensations had imprinted themselves deeper than memory, had become part of Yamamoto's nervous system, would probably trigger without warning for years if he survived that long. They heard voices ahead and froze, raising their rifles. But the voices were speaking Japanese, and after a moment of tense silence, they called out identification codes and were answered. A patrol from the 124th Infantry Regiment emerged from the undergrowth. 6 men led by a corporal who looked at Nakamura's sergeant's stripes with relief that they had encountered someone of higher rank and could transfer responsibility for decisions upward. "What happened to you?" the corporal asked, taking in their burned uniforms and haunted expressions. "American attack," Nakamura said. "Our position was overrun. We're falling back to regroup." The corporal nodded, accepting this without question. Everyone was falling back these days. The Americans were pushing forward across the entire island, and Japanese units were being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. But the corporal's next words made Yamamoto's blood freeze. "Did they use the fire weapon? We heard rumors from the 38th Division. They said the Americans have a weapon that shoots flames, like a dragon from the old stories. We thought it was just fear talking, men breaking and inventing excuses." Nakamura looked at his survivors. Their faces answered the question. "It's real," he said. "The fire weapon is real, and it's worse than rumors. Tell your company commander. Tell everyone. Fixed positions are death traps now. We need to change how we fight." The corporal's expression shifted from curiosity to fear. He glanced at his own men, seeing the same fear reflected back. They all understood what this meant. Their entire defensive strategy for Guadalcanal was based on fortified positions, on making the Americans pay a terrible price for every advance, on forcing them to assault dug-in defenders who could fire from protected positions. But if those positions could be burned out, if concrete and steel and earth couldn't protect against this new weapon, then everything changed. "Where are you headed?" the corporal asked. "Battalion headquarters," Nakamura lied. He had no real destination, no clear plan beyond putting distance between himself and the flamethrowers. "We need to report directly to command." The corporal seemed to accept this. His patrol continued in the direction Yamamoto's group had come from, moving toward the sounds of distant combat, and Yamamoto felt a surge of pity for them. They were walking toward the fire, toward the screaming, toward an enemy that could kill them without ever entering their fields of fire. But he said nothing. What could he say? Refuse to fight? Desert? Those paths led to execution by their own officers. The only choice was to keep moving, keep surviving, and hope that eventually someone high enough in the command structure would recognize the futility of their current tactics. They walked until dark, then found a small clearing where they could rest without making themselves obvious targets. No one suggested building a fire for warmth or cooking. The thought of fire, even controlled fire, was unbearable. They ate cold rice from their packs and shared a canteen of water that tasted like rust and jungle rot. The night sounds of the tropical forest surrounded them, frogs calling, insects chirping, something large moving through the distant undergrowth. And normally these sounds would have been threatening, might have concealed enemy movement, but tonight they were comforting because they were natural, were part of the world that existed before flamethrowers and burning men. Kimura cried quietly in the darkness, soft, hitching sobs that he tried to muffle. No one told him to stop. They were all crying inside, tears that wouldn't fall, but that pressed against their chests and throats, making breathing difficult. Yamamoto stared up at the canopy, where stars occasionally glinted through gaps in the leaves, and he thought about home, about his parents and sister, about whether they knew how bad things were in the Pacific, whether the newspapers told them anything resembling truth, whether they understood that their son might die not in glorious combat, but screaming and burning in some unnamed jungle clearing on an island they had never heard of before the war. "Do you think they feel anything?" Kimura asked suddenly. "The Americans who use that weapon. Do you think it bothers them?" "I don't know," Yamamoto said, though he had been thinking about the same question. The American he had seen had moved with such casual efficiency, such practiced calm, Either he felt nothing, had become completely numb to the horror he created, or he had convinced himself that Japanese soldiers were somehow less than human, that burning them was no different from burning wasps out of a nest or rats out of a hole. Neither possibility was comforting. "My father is a Buddhist priest," Kimura continued. "He taught me that all life is sacred, that killing creates karma that must be answered for in future lives. But this," he trailed off, "this isn't just killing. This is... I don't have words for what this is." "Desecration," Nakamura said from across the clearing. "That's the word. They're desecrating us, making our deaths shameful and degrading. Warriors are supposed to die with dignity, with honor, but you can't die with honor when you're burning alive. You can't maintain composure when your flesh is cooking. They've found a way to strip away everything that makes a soldier's death meaningful. That might be the worst part. Not just that they kill us, but how they kill us. How they make us into something pitiful and pathetic before we die." This observation settled over the group like a cold weight. It articulated what they had all been feeling but couldn't express. The flamethrower didn't just kill, it humiliated. It reduced warriors to screaming, thrashing animals. It made death into spectacle, into something obscene that destroyed the dying man's dignity along with his life. And everyone who witnessed it understood that they might be next, that they might be the one dancing and screaming while flames consumed them, that their last moments might be equally degrading. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by nightmares and sudden waking. Yamamoto would close his eyes and immediately see fire, would feel phantom heat on his face, would smell that sweet, terrible smell, and he would jerk awake with his heart racing. The others seemed to experience the same cycle. They would drift off briefly, then startle awake, then lie staring into darkness before trying again to rest. By dawn they were all exhausted, but at least they had survived another night, had put another day between themselves and the flamethrowers. They started moving again at first light, heading generally north toward where they believed the Japanese lines should be. The jungle was thinner here, more open, and Yamamoto felt simultaneously more vulnerable and more relieved. Open ground meant they could see threats approaching, meant fire couldn't use vegetation to spread and cut off escape routes, but it also meant they were visible to American patrols and aircraft. They found evidence of recent combat everywhere. Shell craters, abandoned equipment, hastily dug graves marked with crude crosses or unmarked entirely. The scale of devastation suggested major engagements, not the small skirmishes that had characterized the early months on Guadalcanal. The Americans were committing serious forces now, pushing hard, clearly intending to secure the entire island. And if flamethrowers were part of that push, if they were deploying them along the entire front, then the collapse of Japanese positions would accelerate. By mid-morning they heard firing ahead and dropped into cover automatically. The sound pattern was familiar: American rifles and machine guns, with the occasional crack of a Japanese weapon answering. But then they heard it again, that distinctive whooshing roar, that sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to primal fear. Someone was getting burned. Someone else was experiencing what Yamamoto and his comrades had witnessed yesterday. More men were learning that death by fire was different from other deaths, was worse in ways that couldn't be explained to those who hadn't seen it. "We should help them," Kimura said, but his voice lacked conviction. "With what?" Nakamura asked. 5 rifles against an American attack force? We'd die without making any difference. Better to preserve ourselves, report what we've learned, maybe save other units from the same fate." It was logical, but felt cowardly. They were soldiers. Their purpose was to fight. But fear had broken something in all of them, had created a gap between duty and capability. They wanted to fight. They wanted to fulfill their obligations and die honorably if that's what fate demanded. But the thought of facing flamethrowers again, of risking that specific death, was paralyzing. They crawled further into cover and waited for the combat sounds to fade. Eventually the firing stopped, replaced by American voices calling to each other, coordinating their advance. Yamamoto and his group waited another hour to be sure the Americans had moved on, then carefully approached the battle site. Bodies lay scattered across a shallow depression that had probably been a defensive position. Most had died from conventional weapons, bullets and grenades and shell fragments, but 3 showed signs of fire. Their corpses were charred beyond recognition, flesh burned away to expose bone, uniforms fused to skin, mouths frozen open in eternal screams. The smell of burned meat hung heavy in the still air. Kimura vomited again. The rest of them stood silently, looking at the bodies, understanding that they were seeing their potential futures. This could be them tomorrow or next week, twisted black statues in some jungle clearing, unrecognizable to their families, unable to be buried properly or mourned appropriately. The modern war had made death industrial, mass-produced, stripped of individual meaning. But the flamethrower went further, made death actively degrading, turned human beings into grotesque caricatures of themselves. They found identification tags on one of the burned bodies and removed them carefully. The metal was hot to touch, had been heated by the flames. Private Yoshida Kenji, age 23, from Kyoto Prefecture. Yamamoto pocketed the tags. Someone should know what happened to Yoshida. Someone should be able to tell his family that he died fighting, even if the manner of death was too horrible to describe in detail. They moved on, leaving the bodies where they lay. There was no time for burial, no equipment to dig graves, and the Americans might return. The jungle would reclaim these men quickly, insects and scavengers and decay doing their work, eventually leaving only bones scattered in the undergrowth. Yamamoto tried not to think about how many other clearings like this existed on Guadalcanal, how many bodies lay unburied, how many men had died terrified and alone and unmourned. For 3 more days they wandered through the jungle, avoiding American patrols, scavenging food from abandoned positions, drinking from streams that might or might not be contaminated. They heard flamethrowers twice more in the distance, that distinctive roar that made them flinch and press themselves into cover even though the danger was kilometers away. The weapon had become a psychological factor independent of its actual presence. Just knowing that flamethrowers existed, that they might be deployed at any moment, changed how every soldier thought about combat, made every position feel like a trap, made courage and determination feel inadequate against an enemy who could project fire like a typhoon of destruction. On the 4th day they encountered a larger Japanese force, the remnants of 3 companies that had been compressed together by the American advance. They were led by a captain who listened to Nakamura's report with growing horror, then called a meeting of all surviving officers and sergeants. In a small command post dug into a hillside, surrounded by exhausted, desperate soldiers, the captain addressed the assembled leaders. "Multiple reports confirm the American flamethrower deployment," he said. "It's not limited to one sector. They're using these weapons across the entire front. Our defensive positions are being eliminated systematically. Battalion headquarters has ordered us to hold this ridge at all costs, but He paused, and Yamamoto could see the internal struggle on his face. "I don't believe we can hold. Not against this weapon. Our only chance is mobile defense, fighting withdrawal, making them pay for ground without allowing them to fix our positions and burn us out." There was silence in the dugout. What the captain was suggesting bordered on mutiny. He was essentially advocating for disobedience of direct orders, for abandoning the fixed position defense doctrine that had been mandated from the highest levels of command. But everyone in that room had either seen the flamethrowers themselves or had heard credible reports from those who had. They all understood that the traditional rules had changed, that Bushido and warrior spirit were meaningless against an enemy who could project fire into bunkers and caves. "If we retreat without authorization," one of the lieutenants said quietly, "we'll be executed for cowardice." "If we stay," the captain responded, "we'll burn. I'd rather face a firing squad than burn alive. At least a firing squad is quick." This brutal calculus, choosing between certain death from their own side or probable death by fire from the enemy, was the trap the Japanese military had created for itself. by making surrender and retreat unthinkable, by threatening soldiers with execution for any perceived cowardice. The command structure had eliminated tactical flexibility. Soldiers were expected to die in place, no matter how futile, no matter how irrational. But human survival instinct could only be suppressed so far. Eventually, when the choice was between definite death and possible survival, men would choose survival regardless of threats and propaganda. The meeting dissolved without resolution. The captain couldn't order a retreat without condemning himself and his officers to execution. But he couldn't order men to sit in prepared positions waiting to be burned either, not without causing mass desertion or mutiny. So they remained in limbo, technically holding the ridge, but actually dispersed in loose formations that could scatter quickly if flamethrowers appeared, trying to follow orders while simultaneously preparing to violate them. Yamamoto and his survivors were assigned to a forward observation position where they could watch for American movement. It was a dangerous posting, but also less confining than being trapped in a bunker or cave. They dug shallow fighting positions that provided some protection from small arms but could be abandoned quickly, kept their equipment ready for rapid movement, and maintained constant vigilance. On the second night at the ridge, they heard rumors spreading through the Japanese positions. Someone claimed that the flamethrower fuel was made from oil extracted from Chinese prisoners, that the Americans were literally burning their enemies with rendered fat from previous victims. Someone else insisted that men burned by flamethrowers could never rest peacefully, that their spirits remained in torment forever. These stories were obviously false, products of shock and fear, and the human need to create narratives that explained the unexplainable. But they spread anyway, growing more elaborate with each retelling, because the truth, that American industrial capacity had produced a particularly effective incendiary weapon, was somehow less satisfying than myths about atrocity and supernatural horror. Yamamoto recognized these rumors as symptoms of mass psychological trauma. The entire Japanese force on Guadalcanal was being affected by the flamethrowers, even soldiers who had never seen them personally. Fear was contagious, spread through stories and whispers, and the visible effects on those who had experienced flamethrower attacks directly. Men who had been calm and professional became jumpy and paranoid. Units that had held positions courageously against rifle and artillery fire now requested permission to relocate, to move away from concealed positions into open ground. The Japanese defensive system was dissolving not because of casualties. They had sustained higher casualties in other campaigns, but because of psychology, because facing an enemy who burned you alive was fundamentally different from facing an enemy who shot or shelled you. The American attack came at dawn, and Yamamoto saw them while morning mist still hung in the valleys, saw their lines moving up the slope in coordinated waves, saw the flamethrower teams positioned at intervals among the infantry. There were multiple teams this time, maybe 8 or 10, and Yamamoto understood that the Americans had learned to deploy flamethrowers in mass, to use them as standard assault weapons rather than specialized equipment. The Japanese positions opened fire, and the sharp crack of rifles echoed across the ridge, but the Americans kept coming, using terrain features for cover, advancing in rushes while machine guns suppressed defensive positions. Then the flamethrowers began their work. Multiple streams of fire arced toward the Japanese positions, and men who had been holding firm suddenly broke and ran. Yamamoto saw an entire squad abandon a well-prepared bunker before flames even reached them, just the sight of fire approaching enough to trigger panic. But others froze or hesitated too long, and the flames found them, and the screaming began again, that high-pitched, inhuman sound that conveyed agony beyond language. And Yamamoto felt his own control slipping, felt his legs preparing to run regardless of consequences. The captain was shouting orders, trying to coordinate a defensive fire, trying to make subordinates concentrate their fire on the flamethrower operators, but his voice was lost in the chaos. A stream of fire swept across a machine gun position that had been slowing the American advance, and the gun fell silent, and the Americans surged forward. Another flamethrower targeted a mortar team, and Yamamoto watched men flee their weapons, abandoning equipment and position and duty to escape the flames. The entire defensive line was collapsing not from casualties, but from fear, from the psychological impact of facing an enemy that could deliver death in such a horrible form. Yamamoto started retreating. He didn't make a conscious decision. His body simply started moving backward, crawling at first, then crouching, then running when he was far enough from the forward positions that running wouldn't draw immediate fire. Around him, other soldiers were doing the same, and soon the retreat became general, became a rout, hundreds of men streaming away from the ridge, dropping equipment to run faster, abandoning wounded comrades who couldn't keep up, thinking only of distance and escape. The Americans didn't pursue aggressively. They didn't need to. They had broken the Japanese defense with minimal casualties, had captured the ridge, and secured their next objective, and they seemed content to consolidate rather than chase defeated enemies into the jungle. But Yamamoto kept running anyway, kept moving until exhaustion dropped him to his knees beside a stream somewhere far behind what had been the front line, somewhere that felt safer even though he knew rationally that safety was an illusion, that the Americans would continue advancing and the flamethrowers would continue burning, and eventually there would be nowhere left to run. He knelt by the stream and looked at his reflection again, and what he saw was someone who had broken, who had failed every principle he had been taught, who had run from battle and abandoned his post and violated his duty. But he was alive. His uniform wasn't burning, his skin wasn't cooking. He could still breathe air that didn't taste like petroleum and smoke, and some part of him, some deep survival instinct that cared nothing for honor or duty or military discipline, was glad. Other survivors appeared gradually, men who had run in different directions but converged on this small stream, and they sat together in silence, not making eye contact, not discussing what had happened, not analyzing their defeat or planning their next move. They just sat, breathing, existing, grateful for another moment of life, even if that life was now stained with cowardice and shame. Eventually, they would have to move again, would have to find other Japanese units, or try to reach evacuation points, or simply wander the jungle until capture or death found them. But for now they sat by the stream, and they were alive, and the flamethrowers were somewhere else, burning other men in other clearings. In his mind, Yamamoto could still see Sato dancing, could still hear those screams, could still smell that sweet, wrong smell of cooking meat. Those images would never leave. They would be part of him forever, would shape every moment of whatever remained of his life. The Americans had won more than a battle or a position. They had won inside the heads of their enemies, had planted seeds of terror that would grow and spread and undermine Japanese will to fight. The flamethrower was a weapon not just of fire, but of fear, and its psychological impact exceeded its tactical value, changed the entire character of the Pacific War, made courage and determination insufficient responses to industrial-scale horror. The spirits of dead soldiers might haunt these jungles forever, but the living carried their own haunting now, carried the knowledge that death could come as flame, could transform warriors into screaming torches, could make the end of life into something beyond horror, into something that had no name and no consolation except the mercy of eventual silence.